Okay. Um, okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I had, following up on a bunch of amazing talks. I was sorry not to be able to be here Monday, Tuesday, but the talks yesterday and this morning, really tremendous and super impressive. I was talking to somebody over lunch as well about how when I started in this business, the idea of doing these kind of brain-computer interfaces that could work this way was just a pipe dream still. Like I wasn't sure it would ever happen in my lifetime, and I'm still have hopefully 20 years of my career to go, and it's already a reality. It's really, really kind of amazing. And so my talk today is a little different, specifically because, or primarily, I would say, because I'm focused on a signal that has its own challenges, different from the complexity of what we've been seeing over the last kind of day and a half. We're dealing with my lab deals a lot with signals from the scalp, which has, and I'll talk about some of the advantages of doing that today, but also it comes with a lot of its own challenges in terms of access to certain frequencies, spatial smearing across the head, and all the kind of stuff that we have to deal with that you don't necessarily have to worry about when you've got an electrode exactly where it should be. And so I had two talks in mind actually to give today. And so I've done probably a foolish thing and put everything in anyway. So we'll see how far I get. The first half of the talk is a little more just, I don't know, I think it's important in a way, but maybe not as flashy and exciting as it might be. And if we have time, then I'll hopefully transition to some of the stuff that we're working on in the lab now that I'm a little bit more excited about. But I still think this first half is quite important. Even if it's not as brand new. I don't know what the policy is these days. We just recently filed a patent, and I'm a founder of a company as of a couple of weeks ago. And in some conferences, you're supposed to disclose all this stuff. So I'm happy to talk to people about that later, but I'll just put it up here just in case it's the proper thing to do. And then I just going back, we heard a lot of this yesterday already about how people are using linear models to map between that's good. Map between different representations you might get from speech and language, for example, and different kinds of neural recordings, whether you pass that speech through a deep language model first or whatever it might be, and ultimately you end up doing a linear mapping. So our group has been doing this kind of linear mapping work with EEG for quite a long time at this point, where we take whatever the features are, and I'll talk about different features, fit some kind of linear model in between, which in our case looks a bit like this because we've got maybe 128 channels on the head, and each channel ends up, response ends up looking a bit like a filter. It is a filter, a linear filter, that somehow then, in some optimal sense, hopefully maps to the EEG recordings that we've got. So you can look at the response in the middle in terms of the parameters, the frequency, the latencies, the amplitudes, the distribution on the head, and so on. Or you can use it like we've been seeing yesterday, and like a forward encoding model where you can fit one of these things and try and predict the data. You can also go the opposite direction. You can take the data and try to reconstruct something about the stimulus. And like I say, we've been doing this for quite a long time. So here's an example of just where we often will try and reconstruct, for example, the speech envelope from the EEG data. And this has the nice advantage that it weights all the channels in some optimal sense, rather than in the case of a forward encoding model where you have to predict each channel individually. And of course, there's lots of other techniques for doing this, but I'm just introducing some of these ideas now. And so this is around the time that I got to meet Malcolm and Shihab and some other folks here for the first time, when I was brought, Malcolm, as he mentioned in the introduction, invited me to come to Telluride to take part in the workshop to see if we could actually decode attention to speech using EEG in something approaching real time, which I must say I was happy to take the invitation and come over to Colorado. I also didn't think it was going to work, by the way, when I came, but yeah, I mean, we had experience of collecting these kinds of cocktail party attention data and needing like half an hour of data from 40 subjects to get a statistically significant result because the quality of the EEG was such. But what we didn't appreciate at the time, and I think Nima was a huge contributor to this at the time, he'd been doing some stimulus reconstruction with some of his studies, and applying that to the EEG, it turned out to work really quite well. And we were able to decode attention, with quite a high degree of accuracy, given, say, a minute's worth of EEG. And so since then, at that time, a lot of people got excited about this notion that you could decode attention with non-invasive recordings like this. Some labs got excited about it. Some companies got excited about it. Hearing aid companies in particular were were excited about the prospect that you could potentially build EEG into a hearing aid somehow, or have some wearable EEG system. And then in real time in a crowded restaurant, the EEG algorithm and electrodes would help you decode who someone was trying to pay attention to, and slightly elevate their voice relative to the background noise, and it would be cognitively steered. And Alan ran a big project in Europe trying to develop this line of work further. And I remember thinking about this at the time, that, you know, I was involved obviously in this first kind of study and was quite excited about the prospect that this might become, you know, a real engineering problem now to try and make this wearable, make it decode it better. And I'm an engineer and a neuroscientist in both departments. And I kind of felt like, you know, at that time, I'd love to be able to clone myself and, you know, have one of me head in the engineering direction and the other one of me go in the neuroscience direction. But I did feel like, you know, there's only so many hours in the day, and I like working, but I like doing other things too. So, you know, I kind of felt like I had to choose one of these paths a little bit, and decided that I kind of would focus a little more on the neural signals and the neuroscience and what was contributing to these data, rather than getting in a kind of a foot race that with industry and with other engineering labs to kind of better decode attention. So I devoted, you know, I had these choices. Do I want to spend my time in the middle here trying to develop better algorithms? Do I want to spend my time looking at linguistics and speech and neural signals? And I kind of focused a lot on the speech language and how they relate to brain signals, continuing more or less to use this same framework, albeit we have a few others as well. And so really what I wanted to do quickly in the first kind of section of the talk was just talk quickly about some efforts we've made to try to find what it is that these neural EEG signals are sensitive to in terms of acoustic and linguistic processing, again, in the context of scalp EEG. And then pose the question kind of, or show you our efforts to recently answer the question as to how much of this EEG is explainable in the first place. You know, because without knowing that, we keep trying different speech features to try to predict EEG, and we don't actually know how much EEG is even modelable in the first place. So we started with a whole bunch of simple ideas. We had started with this envelope stuff. For example, we knew from the EEG literature that if you play a loud tone or a quiet tone, it's not that the response is just bigger or smaller, it's also smeared out in time a little for quieter sounds. So let's try and break our envelope up into different amplitude bins, for example, and instead of fitting one TRF for one envelope, let's fit TRFs for multiple envelopes. And what we found, unsurprisingly, was that the TRFs for quieter sections of the envelope were smaller, but also tended to be smeared out in time. This is a measure of the latency of this large negative peak across different frequency bands. It got later. So this reflected exactly what it should do in terms of ERPs. Yep.
That's what you got, so I have to believe you.
Yep.
But I always thought that the closer you got to threshold, the sharper the tuning.
Yep.
And the louder you made it, that's when it's smeared.
Yep.
But you just said the opposite.
In EEG, that's how it is, yeah. Even in ERPs usually, yeah. Maybe there's something different going on at the level of the cochlea or something like that. I don't know, but that's what. Yeah, yeah.
You're also looking at amplitude, not thresholds.
Yeah, amplitude. Yeah, this is all. Yeah, and this is another representation of it here. You can just see the thing is getting later and later. And so this was just one early effort we made to try to better improve. You know, find some neural or speech representation that would give us better predictions of EEG. And basically, this purple line here is our amplitude quantized envelope, and it's better for every subject than a regular envelope, and so on. And we thought, okay, let's keep going on this tack then and try to continue to find other kind of features that will give us better EEG predictions. One of my excellent colleagues that will be familiar to many people in the room here, Laurel Carney at Rochester, has spent many years working on a peripheral model of the auditory system, cochlear, auditory nerve, inferior colliculus modeling, based on decades of work. So she's right down the corridor from me. So I went and talked to her about this. Instead of me just randomly, arbitrarily dividing envelopes into bins, what if I send the speech envelope through a good peripheral model and then try to model EEG? That should do better too. And so Laurel's model spits out these different responses from the inferior colliculus that she's been validating for many years. And again, we find that if we combined the inferior colliculus output, estimated output with our amplitude binned envelopes, we got even better prediction again. So again, this blue line, the original envelope is this green thing down here at the bottom, and the blue one is better for every subject. Yeah.
That the features that get added that allow you better.
I mean, I think it just takes account of lots of non-linearities. I mean, our whole thing is that we're taking the envelope of the speech signal and relating it to cortical activity when there's all this layers of nonlinear subcortical processing that are happening. And it's not that your cortex receives this speech signal in this envelope, it receives whatever comes out of these. So there's gain adaptation, there's other people are better qualified than I am to tell you what goes on in the cochlea and the auditory nerve and the inferior colliculus.
Yeah,
But
so the green one is it the speech envelope or is it the output of the filter bank?
yeah, it probably was, yeah, a gamma tone filter bank and then just added it all up.
Okay, so it's already filtered.
Already filtered.
So this,
yeah.
okay.
I mean, it was multi-channel and then we added it all up to make one broadband envelope. Yeah. Where we don't add it all up and where we keep it as a kind of a separate set of envelopes is this spectrogram one here in purple. So that's a multi-channel, 16 channels of envelope, if you like.
And the auditory model?
The auditory model is still way better than that.
Yeah, but it's single channel?
The outputs look like this multi-channel.
So it is.
Yeah. Multi-channel, and there's some for oh my gosh, I can't remember what BE and BS stand for in Laurel's model. Different kinds of inferior colliculus cells that she models. Yeah.
The next slide, I think, which is where the prediction was. The prediction is the envelope, or the prediction is the speech?
The prediction is the EEG data. The EEG.
We give prediction accuracy.
Yeah, that is, so we take these speech features, send them through our model that we have fit, and we now have a time course of predicted EEG that we compare to the real EEG. And by the way, for those who are not used to dealing with scalp EEG, these numbers are pretty healthy, actually. You know, we're talking about trying to predict EEG activity through someone's, skull and scalp and everything to auditory responses to speech when there's all this other EEG happening. And the point is that you're never going to predict that more than a certain amount because most of the EEG is completely unrelated to the speech that you're listening to. It's other EEG that's going on. So predicting EEG responses with an accuracy of 0.1 is, with a trial that lasts 2 minutes, typically has a p-value of 10 to the minus 45 or something like that.
I think of your envelope that you showed.
Yeah.
In my world would be a very broad band, and
yeah.
Yet there's envelopes for every frequency region you want to look at.
Yeah.
So instead of looking at the broadband singly,
yeah,
you could also say I have a lot of other envelopes to play with, and
yeah,
if I added those up, maybe I get a much better prediction of these.
Yeah, so we did both of those. So the envelope here is initially it's computed by calculating an envelope for each frequency band and then adding them together. And then the spectrogram is where we don't actually add them together. We send in multiple envelopes in parallel as well. But all of those are still worse than when we add in Laurel's model because it includes these kind of adaptive gain things and all sorts of other stuff that the subcortex does. Then with Giovanni here, we also were interested in looking at other aspects beyond just kind of simple acoustic features or very peripheral things. Because at the end of the day, the cortex is not just taking in these features, it's doing something with them, right? It's converting these sounds into linguistic units of some kind. That's its job in terms of speech processing. We have to recognize that these different sounds correspond to specific linguistic units. So Giovanni split up some of our speech stimuli into, envelope or spectrogram or kind of a categorical labeling of phonemes and so on to try to see if this would allow us to better predict EEG responses to speech. And this one down the bottom here was the key model where we want to try to see how EEG reflects the acoustics of the speech that you're hearing, but also how your brain might be recognizing those acoustics as distinct phonemes, assuming both of those things are happening in different parts of cortex. And of course that worked the best. We were a little concerned about that because it was also the most complex model with the most features. So we had a horrible experiment where we made some of these people come back and listen to the same audiobook played backwards, literally backwards, like 0 to 0, terrible. So all the numbers went down a little because people were struggling to pay attention. But the key point was that this combined model of acoustics and kind of categorical processing was no longer the best.
Question online about accuracy as a function of EEG electrodes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Completely. Yeah. So I mean, I should have had it here. I usually have it on this slide actually, but the accuracy we're talking about for these kinds of plots I'm showing here are all over kind of frontocentral scalp, really, where we reference our EEG to the mastoids just behind the ear. And so if you think of auditory cortex pointing like a battery or a dipole or whatever, the strongest responses tend to be kind of frontocentral here. And so these results are from these areas. If you try and model speech responses over occipital cortex, you basically get 0. Another one we threw in there, I think this was inspired by some work from the Chang lab that had shown certain electrodes in STG seemed not to care at all about envelopes, but seemed to care about relative frequency of a speaker's voice as they, you know, with the prosody and the kind of intonation that they would deliver across a sentence. So we threw that into the mix as well, just to see if that would lead to improvement. So this slide is a bit busy, but basically this prediction here, EFS, is envelopes and frequencies and phonemes and all the stuff that I showed you from Giovanni's study. And then you just throw in a measure of relative frequency of the speaker's voice over the period of the sentence. And it also leads to improved prediction accuracy of EEG data. So this is me giving a very quick overview of a whole bunch of stuff we tried, always trying to improve the EEG prediction accuracy and always trying to see, and of course we're making it up a little bit as well. Like we're choosing these features and everything's correlated with everything else. If Sam Norman Hagner was sitting here now, he tells me all the time, he's down the corridor from me as well these days. He's always talking about how all of these things are correlated with each other and it's very hard to disentangle. And we do a whole bunch of, you know, variance partitioning and partial correlations to try to tease things apart. And we do a lot of experimental manipulations as well. I'm not talking about some of those studies, but to try to really kind of pinpoint which of these features is contributing and can we actually interpret it as such. And then we have a whole other line of work that we started a few years ago, trying to look at how EEG might actually reflect some of the stuff we've been seeing yesterday as well, the actual language that people are hearing, not just the speech and the sounds and the low-level features. So trying to use models, language models. This was an early effort before GPT. We tried this with word2vec, just labeling words with vectors that embed the meaning of those words somehow. And then quantifying each word as it came in as a function of how similar or different that word was semantically from the previous words that the person had just heard. And so you get a number that in some sense conveys how much meaning that word has injected into the narrative because it's so different in meaning from the previous ones. And we got these super cool responses that look very much, for those folks who know EEG, very much like a classic N400 response over parietal scalp. This is not an auditory response anymore. This is a response to word meaning. For example, in the same data set that we had, we tried on the backward speech and the response just kind of goes to 0. This is a plot of forward speech here and backward speech over parietal scalp in the midline. And it worked quite nicely even at the single subject level. So if you're understanding the speech that you're hearing, you see this response. And if you don't understand it, even if it's perfectly good speech, this response will not be there. For example, in cocktail party paradigm, 2 stories, the speech that you're paying attention to, a super strong response. The speech that you're ignoring, there's no response. And so this is the same data set that we would have used in that decoding attention paper I showed earlier with the envelope decoding. And another thing I haven't even included in the talk today, but we did spend a little bit of time wondering whether you're better off trying to decode attention with a strong signal on the scalp that has a small attention effect on it, which is like the envelope, or a weaker signal on the scalp, which is this thing, that has a huge attention effect on it. And ultimately, we concluded that you're better off trying to decode a strong signal on the scalp that has a small attention effect on it, because this thing, you just need too much data to get this response in the first place. Now, once you've got it, the attention effect is huge, but you just need too much data to actually get this. You're only getting so many words per minute, and the response just isn't quite there. But it's an enormous effect. Yeah. So I'm going to come to frequency bands in a minute. But yeah, mostly when we've been doing this, we've just been looking at in the time domain. We filter the data fairly broadly, could be 0.5 to 15 hertz, and we just look at the time course of it. And I can talk a bit more about frequency bands in a minute. I'd be interested to hear if you do have thoughts. Yeah, we can chat about that later, maybe. Yeah.
And I'm really impressed by how much suppression there. It seems like it's actually greater than the amount of excitation in this or enhancement.
So I wouldn't think of this necessarily as either. Is this what shot meant?
Well, okay, maybe suppression is the wrong word.
Yeah, I wouldn't think about that in the context of EEG, exactly, yeah.
Right, but just in terms of the generators for the attended speech, sort of blue area, we'll
Yeah.
call it that. What are you actually covering there? Do you see any frontal effects at all?
Yeah, so others have, Kia Nobre and others have done back in the day. We think of this very much as analogous to the classic N400, which is elicited in these paradigms where, you know, the dentist told me to brush my tree or something like that. And you get this weird word and you have this big negativity here. And so back in, I guess, the 80s, 90s, people did a bunch of source modeling to try and figure out where these N400s were coming from. And yeah, there's a whole trajectory of brain areas that are involved. And I think it does involve a bit of IFG, for example. And we're just assuming this is more or less the same thing. Okay, so yeah, just the point here that I made a minute ago, where this actually reflects the fact that individual people, you know, this is sensitive to whether an individual person is understanding the speech. Something that came up briefly, I think, earlier today was a discussion, and this is another example. This is me and my inferiority complex with EEG after seeing all the amazing like neural pixels and types of data we've been looking at the last couple of days. You know, there's still a place for EEG. For example, this is a new collaboration we have going with some colleagues at Weill Cornell in New York City and NCAN in Albany, and looking at patients who are in a reduced state of consciousness. So this is just a paper we just published last week. 2 kids, unfortunately, who had very severe head injuries and were deemed by the hospital to essentially be in a coma, in a vegetative state. They were unresponsive to any of the clinical tests. Squeeze my hand, pin pricks, shining light in the eyes to see if the pupil will dilate. No evidence of any kind of cognitive function in these people. The kids were still breathing by themselves and could be fed by various tubes or intravenously or however. So the hospital is done with them. It's like, we got nothing else we can do with these kids, so you take them home. And so the parents, and this can happen, right? Because you're trying to be optimistic and reading things maybe that aren't there, but parents may occasionally convince themselves that there's some reaction from the kid that they can discern. But it's a very tricky business, and there's life or death decisions happen with this stuff too, in certain situations where someone can't breathe by themselves, if there's no evidence of cognitive function. They may turn the ventilator off, for example. So we showed just recently in just 2 kids who were in this state and were ruled as having no cognitive function by the hospital. This is just an envelope response to the sound in the first kid. That showed a very clear response to sound. Okay, that's fine, that's good start, but it doesn't show that they have any cognitive function. But this was negative, this N400 looking thing to the meaning of the words in this kid's appropriate story that we played to this child. And there's some statistical tests on this that show that it was not an accident, that it looked like this, and it was distributed on the head in a way that made sense. And the same with the second kid, again, a strong auditory response, which doesn't necessarily demonstrate cognitive function, but again, some statistically significant evidence that they're understanding the meaning of the words that they're hearing in this story. So this was huge news for the parents of these 2 kids, as you can imagine.
So this is like an alcohol word thing? Or?
No, so same thing. So audiobooks, age appropriate audiobooks. And then we predict the EEG data with indices of lexical surprisal for each word. These days we do this now with, unlike Broderick's original paper, we do this with GPT-2. We derive a measure of lexical surprisal for every word and feed that in as the regressor. Yeah.
Cool.
Do you regress out spurious correlations between the audio and the meaning?
Yeah, we usually include other features like word onset, impulses, things like that, just as a to soak up variant. An envelope we'll often feed in parallel as well to soak it up. And then again, the distribution on the head is so different for these things. Usually it's not so hard to by the way, even if you don't do GPT-2 and you just feed in impulse responses at the start of every word, you usually will still get some kind of N400 looking thing at the back if they understand what's going on. Yeah.
Does this require consciousness, or is it like a straightforward trained neural network also produce this without consciousness? Can you conclude from this that
I would conclude that it does, in the sense that, so we've tried a few things before in kind of healthy adults in the studies we were doing. For example, this response is just not there if you're not paying attention to speech. So in the unattended cocktail party stuff that we do, I showed a second ago, it's just not there at all. This is the bottom row here, and this red line, there's just no response to the surprisal to the words, because you're not listening to this content and you're not therefore surprised about anything. We did another study where we had folks listen to the speech played in the narrative order, and then we jumbled up the order of the words. So the same words are coming in, but it doesn't hang together. There's no prediction that the person's making about the next word. Again, it just goes to zero. So we think it's dependent on the person absorbing the context and making appropriate predictions of upcoming speech. These kids, one of them had an anoxic brain injury and I think was just starved of oxygen for a period of time. So I think that was quite a diffuse issue. I don't remember exactly what was going on with participant number 2. Yeah. So that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've been wanting to do. Yeah, the question is about fitting semantic features, because when we do this stuff here, you know, you out of the output layer of some of these networks, you get a whole or the middle layer of one of these language models, you get a whole vector of numbers that embeds the meaning. And all we've ever done with the EEG really is reduce that down to one dimension that says how much different this word, how this word differs from the previous one semantically. So we're taking 300 dimensions or 400 dimensions and collapsing it to one. We have tried that with EEG. We thought we had successfully decoded semantic content, and I know John Remy King has done some stuff with the MEG. And we thought we had a whole paper written, about to press submit button, and we realized that the stimulus we were using was just too homogeneous. It was the same speaker reading the same story, saying a lot of the same words over and over and over again. So we were fearful that the decoding was really an accident. We were inadvertently decoding on the basis of acoustics because of correlations between specific acoustics of specific words and the semantic vectors of those words, if that makes sense. So we're collecting new data now from a range of different speakers, all reading different things, and we're going to try and do decoding across these speakers and stories to try to get around that problem. Yeah.
What happened to the kids?
Yeah, where did you go?
And I'm afraid they're dead. Yeah, no, I'm afraid they're dead. And they died. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Show me this to the parents.
one of the parents is an absolute, she is amazing. She is so energetic and advocating for work in this space. She's part of the reason we formed this company. This company that I declared at the beginning is a lot about not about trying to make money as such, but trying to use companies and other funding mechanisms to drive this work forward, to make it a reality for people, because through the R01 mechanism and in a university on its own, it's very hard to push some of this stuff actually out into the real world and get it happening. So she's a kind of a member of the board of that company, and you know, just a tireless advocate for trying to push this work forward for other families, even though her son has passed away, unfortunately.
You saw that, think that that they're not quite in a full vegetative state?
Absolutely.
So that's a tough call.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, these kids were breathing by themselves and were at home and being fed. So there was no call to be made in this case. They were looked after as best they could, and they happened to pass away after time because of this horrendous injury they'd sustained. But the hope is that we can develop this further such that in situations where a call has to be made, someone's on a ventilator and the doctors are convinced that there's no residual cognitive function, that this might be a test that would be required to be done before any big decisions are made at some point. Yeah.
Just following up on that. So I know the main focus is really not consciousness or a biomarker for consciousness, but just, I'm curious, could you not imagine that some kind of detection system, you know, for example, we know when there's a unexpected sound, you could be asleep or you could be in a vegetative state and still get that kind of MMN. So does that really tell you very much about conscious awareness at all?
Well, this is our argument for why we think this is a good approach, because we would be worried in a situation that, like you're talking about, that some very low level habituation or something, adaptation to a tone might be enough for a different tone to produce something that looks like an MMN. Whereas we argue that this is actually contingent on the person processing the meaning of the speech and being appropriately surprised by the content.
It's a bit less restrictive in the sense that they can have a language model in their head.
Yeah.
And so they can still be unconscious, quote unquote. But if you do the content body or attention and all that,
yeah,
and they listen to their mother's voice maybe or something, that's the one they accept.
Yeah.
That might be a little bit more.
Yeah, my colleagues have done that too. They've been playing kind of age appropriate audiobooks at some of the patients they've been working with, and in parallel, someone reading the US tax code or something like that. They're instructing the kid to also try and pay attention, but they're not actually sure in advance the kid can hear that. So they're trying to set it up such that the kid would be more inclined to pay attention to one of the stimuli to see if we could. And James O'Sullivan was involved with this too and showed a little bit of attention decoding using envelopes in some of these kids as well.
So the same kind of medical condition?
Yep.
So did you check to see if they were sleeping first, or you knew they weren't sleeping?
No, you don't know.
So there's-
I mean, I guess you can, I mean, that's an issue. Yeah. I mean, some of these kids will have appropriate evidence of wake sleep cycles just if you were to record their EEG, and some of them don't necessarily show that. That could be another marker. But again, that doesn't actually, even if they do have a signature of appropriate wake sleep cycles, it doesn't actually mean they're conscious while awake even.
For me, the spanning mismatch of sounds is a big key.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I would expect that
again,
to
if
go
they're
away.
asleep, that would go away. I actually
Yeah.
pitched a pilot grant on that, but it didn't get funded. Just to do it in healthy people, have them go asleep and try and see if this thing is there. Okay. Yeah, so a couple of other ideas. So I'm still in this space. I mean, this was an important aside. And in fact, our colleagues are very excited about this even more in terms of not just being able to assess that cognitive function is there or not there, but even potentially by using different speech materials, being able to assess the level of cognitive function. If the kid can follow some very basic book versus something written for 14-year-olds, you know, if the kid can't follow that or sustain his or her attention to that, that would be index of kind of lower level of cognitive function, for example. It's a long way to go, but anyway. So all of this is still on the theme of just trying to predict EEG responses from different speech features. Some of the newer efforts I just threw in here as well, just to finish on this theme that I think are quite nice. Jin is a very talented PhD student in the team, and Andy was a research faculty member in the team until fairly recently when he started his own group at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He's very talented. He would have been fantastic here in terms of understanding of modern language models and how they can be used to model brain data. He does lots of fMRI and ECOG and EEG himself now these days. So yeah, so in this study, we just did a very simple thing. Again, I emphasize that we haven't spent a ton of time looking at this linear modeling piece in the middle and trying to improve upon that. And I'm always happy to see other groups doing that and keen to adopt their methods into what we're doing to give us better sensitivity. One thing we did realize recently, and again, it goes back to the same thing I showed at the start, where envelope responses can be delayed for quieter envelopes, for example, and louder ones. We also were interested to see if that might be an issue in the context of these predictive words and how surprising words are. Like we just assume in our linear model, the shape of this kind of N400 looking response is the same. And it's just bigger when a word is surprising and it's smaller when a word is not surprising. But that's an assumption that's possibly not true as well. So Jin, instead of fitting our normal kind of TRF where it's just a function of the surprisal of the words, he fit another model where the TRF itself could be altered in amplitude in interesting ways across different words. It could be altered in the kind of temporal scale of it. It could be more smeared out in time or more compressed in shape, according to this parameter C, or it could just be shifted in time. It could be earlier or later as a function of how surprising the word was. And he used a kind of an optimization algorithm, just how well can he train these three parameters based on the actual EEG that we have to try to see if surprisal has a kind of a nonlinear multiplicative effect on the amplitude or warps the shape of the TRF in interesting ways or shifts it in time. And basically, so that's what this looks like. Will it be shifted in time based on the surprisal of words or in amplitude or in shape? And basically he found that, that it's, if you allow the TRF to kind of shift more in amplitude and in time, you get a better fit with your EEG data. And basically the punchline here is that words that are more surprising have larger kind of TRFs that are also later. They peak later in time. Our interpretation of this might be that, words that are predictable are just processed so much more easily that you get a smaller response. It's also more quickly resolved. So our title of the paper was that, words that are predictable are basically processed earlier or more quickly. Now, again, this led to better prediction accuracy of EEG data. I think this is a nice, interesting scientific finding. I would not necessarily recommend to everybody to go rushing out to try to implement this whole optimization framework in terms of prediction accuracy, because it is a significant improvement, but it's a super tiny significant improvement in prediction accuracy that we got here by incorporating this time shift. But I think it's kind of important. as a science finding nonetheless. It also showed as well, by the way, that it's not just the surprisal of the present word, the current word, it's also the surprisal of the last word impacts how you respond to this word. And the timing of that depends on this word, but also on whether the previous word was a surprising word as well. Question?
We tried to kids.
I haven't, but my colleagues have tried a whole slew of different high-level, low-level features. And again, the other piece that we're trying to argue with this specific approach, ASSRs could potentially work, right? Can you pay attention to it? Will the ASR increase, decrease? But a kid who's in, first of all, that wouldn't have the potential that the speech does at assessing language level ability across different kinds of speech materials. And also, you know, asking somebody in a condition like this to care about some beeps and pay attention to them is not that easy to do. One would imagine, and having an engaging story, or their parent, you could have a microphone in there, their parent is telling them about their little brother's soccer match at the weekend, or whatever it might be, that might be just more engaging. Speaking their name, yeah. Jonathan?
Thanks. I don't think you should be so apologetic about this, this extra significance, the effect size being small. These effect sizes are small.
Yeah.
Because the signals are small compared to the raw auditory signal.
Sure. These effects are really small. I mean, the only reason I'm being apologetic about this one is that I got some emails after we published it from some labs who are interested in assessing, you know, how EEG might be useful for hearing, you know, assessing hearing function, things like that. It was a lot of effort to code up this kind of optimization framework. And folks were, I was a little worried that some folks were going to just devote tons of effort to this and buy themselves very little in terms of sensitivity to different levels of hearing, for example. I mean, people are welcome to try it, of course. I'm just giving that.
He wanted that to happen.
Who did?
Jim Jerger.
Oh, yeah.
Who worked with his N400 probably for decades.
Hmm.
He thought that he had enough evidence that it should definitely go into the clinic.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And my colleagues have tried just the classic N400 with these kids too, and it actually works reasonably okay. But again, we think the natural speech thing has some advantages there too, because again, will a kid with a disorder of consciousness continue to care about sentences with weird endings when you're on sentence number 48? Like, maybe not, whereas they might still be interested in the story they're listening to, yeah.
So this is a really cool method. I wonder, what is your interpretation of the increased and photoreceptive field? Is it deep? Is it a delayed response? Is it contextual?
I mean, there's lots of theories on what the N400 is still debated a little bit, whether it's, you know, an increased effort to incorporate the current word into the context of what you were listening to before. For example, working memory, updating, all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure I want to take a stance on that particularly, not having read as much of it. Well, I've read quite a bit of it, but if the N400 folks can't yet agree, I don't want to be the one to argue. But yeah, I mean, our interpretation in many ways was just that words that are more easily predicted are also, you know, they're more easily absorbed into the context. The amount of neural effort that's required to process them is less, so the response is smaller and resolves more quickly. And really, that's it.
Quick one. Kind of convolution. I wonder if you can change, for example, the dilation of the convolution or something to resolve a delayed response versus an integrated response.
Yeah, the dilation was in there also. There was a shift, an amplitude parameter, a shift parameter, and a dilation parameter. The dilation parameter didn't add any value. Yeah. Okay, so a little closer to what some other folks were talking about yesterday and this morning. We've also been using more. Is it even state of the art? I can't keep up. So something that was state of the art a few months ago, at least, Whisper, which folks may know, you know, is a speech kind of recognition system where you feed in audio in the form of spectrograms, and it recognizes what the speech is. And so there may be people here who know more about exactly how this works than I do, but the principle is that you're going from audio to meaning somehow, or audio to speech at some point. So there's a speech to language transformation happening across the layers here, and that's what's happening in our brains too. And another question we had was, would EEG be sensitive in a similar way? Is your brain doing some similar kind of speech to language transformation, and would that speech to language transformation show up in EEG signals? So Andy trained or sent some of our stimuli through Whisper and was able to pull activations out of different layers of Whisper, which again should be going from more acoustic to more linguistic as you go across, and did some data reduction techniques and stuff. And then, like we saw yesterday, took the output of these layers and tried to predict EEG with them. And the main message is that as you go across the first 6 layers of Whisper, EEG predictions just keep getting better and better. And so he compared those to some of the other things that we've tried, envelopes and spectrograms and word surprisal from GPT-2. And these later layers of Whisper were better than all those things. And like I say, this is evidence, I think, that EEG is not just reflecting the acoustic processing in layer 1, but is reflecting some speech to language transformation that's analogous in some way to what Whisper is doing. What exactly that is, don't know, but again, this is the plot I should have had earlier showing which channels we tend to predict quite well. Again, these kind of, again, we reference the mastoid, so you get this kind of pattern that's reflective of auditory cortical activity. It's there. We get this nice positive slope across the layers for attended speech. It's a flat line for unattended speech, so that you're basically not doing a speech to language transformation for unattended speech because you're not paying attention to it. You're hearing it, and you can model responses to unattended speech in terms of their acoustics, but the models of the responses don't improve as you include linguistic features because your brain is not converting the unattended speech to linguistic. Yeah.
This specific setting, when you say unattended, it's like a cocktail.
Cocktail party. Yep. Yeah. And then Andy did a bunch of work kind of comparing the Whisper predictions to other ones. He used GPT-2 to show that the point here is that Whisper, if you combine Whisper with GPT-2 to predict EEG, it doesn't do any better. This is the union here. It doesn't do any better than Whisper on its own. So in other words, whatever Whisper is doing, it's capturing a lot of the same EEG activity that would be explained by GPT-2 here. He showed that context matters, how much context you use when you feed and when you derive the Whisper measures. If you use 10 seconds of context to produce your Whisper activations, it does better than if you use less. He jumbled up Whisper's activations a little bit within words to see if it actually, the EEG is reflecting the kind of processing within the word level, or is it just all happening at the word level? And for almost all subjects, the predictions got worse when he did this jumbling. So it seems to actually really be sensitive to the sub-lexical ordering of syllables and phonemes as they come in. And then he also compared it to some other kind of machine learning methods for speech processing to suggest that basically to highlight some similarities in terms of the fact that, or really just to validate that Whisper really was doing something linguistic under the assumption that Wav to Vec and Hubert, their middle layers, are actually doing something semantic or linguistic.
Can I ask a question about so then you thought as a function of layer?
Yeah.
So it's taking just the features of those
of each layer. Yeah.
Or the next layer.
Correct.
And if you combine them all, is there a
good question? Don't know.
I haven't heard that.
Andy might have tried it. I don't know. I can't remember.
We expect that you get a richer
Yeah.
representation.
That's interesting. It seems like something I should have thought to ask him to try.
Yeah, I was looking back at the coalition scores that we see, the 0.055.
Yeah.
It seems a little lower from the earlier stuff you were showing with the auditory, like periphery model, and they're the best seem to be around 10%.
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, these may be. I'm trying to remember if these are different data sets collected with different stories, or they're probably collected with the same system because we've been using the same system for a long time. That is a good question. But I still think, I mean, this one, yeah, that's a good question. I think this was probably capturing different activity, right? Because I'm arguing that this is capturing some linguistic transformation. I think what is likely to happen if we put a front-end peripheral model on it is that this slope would still be there. Everything might be shifted up a little. Is what I suspect would happen, but that might be worth trying. In fact, thanks. Great. Okay, so all this time we've been trying to predict these EEG responses to speech and explain stuff. And you know, how do we know when to stop? Have we predicted everything? You know, are these even the right features? Are there other features we just haven't thought of? And of course, there's always this big caveat that so many of these features are correlated with other ones that it's hard to actually draw concrete conclusions from some of the models. But Jane recently has been just trying to estimate the explainable variance of some of our EEG data. And the common approach for doing this is in neuroscience, a lot of the time is to present the same stimulus multiple times and try to get an estimate of how consistent the response is relative to the variance in the noise. But I would argue, I think reasonably enough, that this is not a good way to do this for natural speech, because as soon as you play the same speech again a second time, people are just fundamentally not processing it the same way. They're probably not paying attention to it the same way. They're certainly not being surprised by the information content of words in the same way because they've already heard it. And we've seen some evidence of these surprisal measures, for example, going off a cliff pretty quick across a few repetitions. So hearkening back to something that came up yesterday, I think it was Sam that said it, although I'm not sure he chose Shihab as an example here, said, you know, the best predictor of his brain activity is someone else's brain activity.
That's what it's all wrong.
That's what, yeah. So along the same lines, we thought to do the same thing. So we had a data set where we had 19 people who'd listened to about an hour's worth of an audiobook, the same audiobook. And the idea really was to try to predict EEG data in one target subject based on the data from all the other people, assuming that they, you know, all speak English to a similar level. They all have auditory systems that work broadly similarly. So the steps involved were to take some subset of the training subject, so to speak. We wanted to, you know, everybody's cortex is folded differently. Their EEG responses will be a little different in terms of time lags and distributions on the head. So we used MCCA, one of Alan's approaches, with some time lags built into it to try to find some filter, spatiotemporal filter that would identify common components across all of those training subjects. We reduced the data set down, then dimensionality down to 4 common components across all of these 18 people. And now we've got 18 times 4 components that we can use to predict the 128 channels of data in the target person, which we did using just TRFs.
Why did you choose for? What did you decide on for?
On 4,
You could argue that those 4 could be controlling physiological function.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it may have been, I should have a better answer. It may have been simply empirically that he tried a lot of stuff and this is what worked best. I don't think we had any principled reason to stop at 4 more than, yeah.
I mean, there is one reason, which is overfitting, because you're going to be testing it on left out data.
Yeah.
The more components you put in, more parameters.
Yeah, certainly, and then just computationally having too many components was a bad idea. So we tried with 4, and then what we could do is we could actually change, because the other point is we have 19 participants here. EEG is really noisy, right? So even you're trying to predict someone's EEG, one person's EEG data with 18 other people, it's still not enough. You'd like to have 1,000 people to predict this one person with. And so to get around that, what we did was we subsampled the data. So this is our effort to predict the EEG in one target subject with fewer numbers, with 3 subjects, 5. The distributions here are because you can choose any 3 out of the 18. You can choose any 5 out of the 18 or whatever. So you can see that as you include more subjects in your group to predict with, the numbers go up in terms of how well you can predict your target subject. And then basically we fit a curve to this to extrapolate out to infinity subjects and have a guess as to that's possibly how much prediction we could get in this individual if we actually had 1,000 people in the study. And the punchline here really is that, you know, we're never going to predict that much EEG because it's just the nature of the signal. But the punchline really is that our estimates so far of how much EEG we should be able to predict, those estimates are higher than most of our efforts to actually predict the EEG with certain features. So the point is that we still think there's signal in the EEG that's yet to be discovered somehow, albeit we've predicted a lot of it already. I may skip this. This is a super cool project. I want to talk to Alan about this because he's helping us out think about this too. This is well, maybe very quickly I'll just describe. Another thing we were worried about is that we're always trying to tease apart what is an acoustic response versus what's actually related to speech and linguistic processing, and trying to model that explicitly with our models, but it's a tricky thing to do. Everything's correlated with everything else. This study is a different way of doing it, where we presented stories to participants. They're listening to the story, and then in the next section, they read the story flashed up on the screen with exactly the same timing as they would have heard it. So it's like he was an old man who fished alone in a skiff or whatever, old man of the sea. And then they do listening, reading, listening, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. Then they go back to the start, and now they do reading, listening, reading. So we have a copy of each, for each subject, they have seen the same chapter, they've read the same chapter, and they've heard the same chapter with exactly the same timing. And the idea is to compare the EEG data sets that we get and find common signal between the two EEG data sets that we would argue must be linguistic. It's not auditory because there's only auditory in one. It's not visual because there's only visual in one. We find the common signal between those two conditions, and we would argue that that is a nice representation of whatever linguistic stuff is happening in the speech. I'll skip briefly. Okay, one last thing. I had a whole other line of work I wanted to we were talking yesterday about top down and bottom up, and we've got this whole, one of the things I'm super excited about at the moment is how predictions of upcoming words not just reflect how those words are processed, but feed down the system to affect how you actually hear those words as they come in. So really top down semantic level predictions, will your auditory cortex encode the sounds of those words differently? And we have quite a bit of evidence at this point to suggest that it does. And we're particularly interested in that as an index of top-down prior predictions, predictive coding in the context of speech. And we have 2 active lines of work ongoing with patients with schizophrenia who do and who do not hear voices. We have a whole 30 patients collected already, half of them who do hear voices and half of them who don't, with the view to testing the notion that patients who hallucinate voices overuse their predictions of the world to hallucinate voices into existence that aren't there. And we also have a data set collected in adolescents with autism under the assumption that was not our hypothesis necessarily, but under the hypothesis that they tend to use their model of the world less in predicting upcoming sensory input and then get overly sensitive to that sensory input, or, you know. So that's a whole other 5 slides, 10 slides at the end of this that I'm not going to have time to go to. But the last thing I'll just finish on super quick, just because it's a workshop where we're supposed to be maybe a little provocative or something. Going back to the question we had earlier about the frequencies and so on, you know, we see that in our lab, lots of labs has been doing EEG, MEG for a long time, presenting speech, seeing that the dynamics of the speech tracks along